I'm right now currently doing a tutorial of me writing music. This is actually the second part to a series that I think I want to continue today. So currently I've been working on the piece by Avenged Sevenfold, written for the full orchestra. So last time I put this together, most of it had already been pre-written. I feel like there's like a primary stage to writing, and then there's what might be called like an embellishment. So what I'm gonna do today is I'm actually gonna start blocking in like just the basic elements of the music, um, and go from there. The second stage, the embellishment, would basically be so now that you have like your melody written in, now that you have like the basic harmony or like the bass line written in, just kind of like making the composition more complete, sound a little bit more symphonic. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and start blocking what I want to call the melody for this part. So before I do that, I'll go ahead and play what I've got thus far, so you can hear what we're working with so far. All right, so one thing that I've noticed when using finale, it can be a little bit difficult to distinguish the melody from the harmony. There are obvious ways to deal with that issue, and I might demonstrate that here really quickly. Um, the most obvious way, as you can see I did here, the rest of the orchestra is playing fortissimo. This is playing forte fortissimo or fortissimo, because the melody right now is in the French horn here. The rest of these parts, though, as they stack up, becomes more difficult to hear the melody because of basically how just the nature of using virtual instruments. I tend to cheat a little bit here, which doesn't look good in the final scoring and printing. But whenever I run into this issue, um, I've gotten into the habit of overlaying multiple layers of a particular part. This way, it's clearly distinguished above the rest of the orchestra. Your audience isn't fighting to hear it. It's not really the most advisable method, but if you're like me, you just really want it to sound good. Um, but yeah, so that I just wanted to mention that. See, now when we first played it, it was very difficult. I wouldn't say it was too difficult to hear the French horns, but it wasn't clearly distinguished. And it's really important when an audience hears music that you can clearly distinguish the melody from the harmony. And then here you see how the melody is no longer in the French horns starting at this section. It's moved to the trombones. And since I haven't done anything to distinguish the trombones, it's barely heard. So by overlaying the part, with a second layer, it's easier to hear. And like I said, this is kind of just like a hack for using the software. All right, and basically it's really just about how to best work with whatever software you're using to create that initial audio file. So in case you're ever showcasing your music, especially in a professional setting, it's gonna do a lot of good to know these things. Um, but anyway, like I said, that's just a hack. Before you print the music, you'll certainly want to undo all that. Now, so I decided for this next part, um, I'm gonna I'm most likely going to put the melody in the low brass section. So I'm just going to start blocking in the melody here. So now one thing, if you are familiar with this song, these notes right here, these eighth notes, as opposed to these 16th notes, they are kind of like the distinguishing element in this melody. There are two things of particular note that I noticed when I listened to the music. Not only are those notes that are written as eighth notes here, not only are they like readily heard by the ear, but they also have a particular articulation. And part of it is that the guitarist who plays this part emphasizes the note a little bit by making it a little bit louder just for these eighth notes, as opposed to the 16th notes, which are kind of like a passing through to the next eighth note. So what I like to do, these are called staccatos. I don't know, I don't think you can see them, but this right here, I just put in a staccato. That shortens the note. Now, I said that then the note kind of distinguishes itself, and by putting the staccato here, it adds kind of like to me it does add a distinguishing element in that the note it just has a certain structure to make it more readily heard. Like following it with a silence, like shortening the note creates this sort of like I don't know, like bombacity almost. But at the same time, we want the note to be louder also. Um, Now, what can produce that element based on musical language is the inclusion of an accent. Um, the accent simply asks the player to emphasize the note a little more. And this can be interpreted many different ways. Some people will explicitly just play it louder, but it can be tailored based on just the general like sentiments and the movements of the music. Um, in this circumstance, just for absolute clarity and for that element being heard through the music notation software, I'm going to add a staccato accent This way, it produces both effects. It's not highly common to see in music, but for the sake of translating exactly what you want to be heard in your music to the performer, this can be useful. All right, and just to make sure everybody knows, the instruments I'm working with right here, this here is the trombone. It's written here, the abbreviated here. This here is the tuba. So that'll complete adding in the initial elements to this melody just for this four bar phrase. I'm just going to copy the rest or this back to the next two or forward to the next two measures to complete the four measure phrase. And with that completed, now we can look at other elements in the score. So of course, based on the original song, there's guitars, bass, singer, drums. We might then benefit from using every aspect that's included in the original song, but translating it in a more appropriate way to the orchestra. Because if I wanted to, I could put an official drum kit here. But for the sake of me wanting to make this sound a little bit more symphonic, that's not what I'm doing. Now, of course, every orchestra has the ability to use a snare drum just like a drummer does. Every orchestra has the capacity to use a bass drum, just like the rock band does. So those are the two primary instruments I'm going to use. Now, it's not going to be nearly as involved. I think what the bass and the snare drum are going to do here is just kind of emphasize the beat a little bit. So I'm really just going to reiterate this melody through the snare drum here, and it's only really just carrying the beat along. And for the bass drum, to be reasonable, even though sometimes some, especially heavy metal artists, will have very involved bass parts. The bass really in the orchestra functions kind of like a pulse, and sometimes even just like a mass of reverberation. And I think that works well at this part, where right here where the accented emphasized notes are, that's a good place to put that kind of pulse. And it's been said before that the bass drum isn't really meant to be heard so much as it is kind of felt by the audience. All right, so let's play this just to see where we're at. Okay, and that basically lays the foundation for what we're hearing in the music at this particular part. There isn't really much harmony during this four bar phrase, but that by no means should limit somebody from adding in more embellishments. What I'm gonna do, I think, is add in, like, basically just fill out this melody a little bit more. And I think what I'm gonna do actually is pull in the full string orchestra here. Um, uh, the obvious choice I think would be to add in the low strings. We'll just cater that to them a little bit. What I think I'll do here also is spread the part down the octave, down to the next octave, just to add a little bit more of. I feel like it adds an acoustic value to have a part doubled up like this. So it's played in octaves. It adds kind of, to me, like a mystifying surround element. Um, to me, it's a technique I use a lot. It's a technique I've seen used a lot. But for that reason, I also wanted to bring this the double bass part here down another octave just to add even more of that acoustic emphasis, or acoustic enhancement, I should say. So by doing that, by adding in those low strings, it fills up the room with a little bit more noise. Now, when you hear this song, this part is it's a little bit more powerful. So you want to emphasize that this is like kind of like a point of a particular prowess for the performers, and that has to be seen in the music and translated to the musician by that means. I'm also adding in crescendos here to create that effect. Let me make sure the dynamics here. Okay, yeah, it was at a forte, and there must be a distinction between the forte and the fortissimo. The crescendo adds just a little bit of a transitory kind of um, I guess it's kind of like a transition scene, but it makes it, instead of there being a start and a stop point, kind of like a gradual rise into this part of more important emphasis. I'd say this whole part right here is kind of leading up to, it's really, this part leads up to this phrase, and then this phrase incidentally also leads up to the next one. It's just like a growing set of values that all just are enhanced along the way. Now I said I wanted to add in the full string orchestra, so I have the violin and the viola here. Um, what I'm going to do, since this is a very simple part, and it's going to be made more complex later, as can be heard in the original piece, I'm just going to add in the octavated notes in the treble clef. Now, something I did here, which was actually an accident, was I kept this note here, the D, throughout the duration of the 4-bar phrase. And now the melody actually lifts up to the G sharp and the A, but I'm curious to see how it's going to sound if I keep it here at the home bass note. I think it adds a little bit of variety, and I like it. I think I might enhance this note right here a little bit. And that way, since we haven't actually produced a full chord yet, we do get some essence of a chord here. We go from we go from single note to two notes to three different notes. So that's kind of like a small little element that most people won't really they won't readily see that you've done that. Um, but it enhances the music, and it's kind of cool knowing that what you did there was you kind of like 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 incrementally created a chord, a basic chord progression. All right, so I'm gonna go ahead and let this stand as it is. Since this 4-bar phrase is pretty simple, I think it's okay to keep it that way since the next part is going to be a bit more complex. So what I'm going to go ahead and do, like I did with this 4-bar phrase here, I'm going to go ahead and block in the basic melody, which I think I'm actually going to add here to the woodwind section. My apologies. I just realized I muted my mic. My cat was making some noise earlier and I forgot to unmute it. But what I basically was saying here at this part. Okay, so the quality of the sound that's produced in the original song here, it's kind of it resembles the plucking of a string, which would be called pizzicato for stringed instruments. But I'm using here the woodwind section, the flute, the oboe, the clarinet, and the bassoon. Now, I think there are several ways you can emulate that sound of plucking. And what I did here is I used both ways that I thought are the most communicable in the 21st century. Now, of course, you can use what's called a staccato here, just like we use the staccato for these notes here to emphasize these sort of like grounding notes for that melody. But at the same time, you can actually use verbal or written language to indicate these types of styles. And that opens the door to so many different possibilities, especially when it comes to actually presenting the music before a musician. Some things that you can't really emulate or maybe can't so much convey through articulation can be conveyed through text. Now, detached is a good way of kind of describing the characters of the notes. There's a bit of space between them. Pardon me. Yeah, so there's a space between them, which distinguishes them just like what the staccatos do. And detached is like a good way of describing just how the player should play each of the notes. All right, so I've blocked in the melody here. I'm going to go ahead and make an attempt at creating some sort of harmonic values. Okay, so basically what I realized when I thought about the music itself is this melody here, it really kind of set the groundwork, the melody as in right here in the trombones and the tuba from the last section. It sets the groundwork for the parts that follow it, for the phrases that follow it, I should say. And that being said, this melody that came in here, or you could argue it that it's actually more of a harmonic value. But this part that's now being emphasized in this 4-bar phrase just lays over top of the original groundwork. So it's like a compilation of sounds that's growing and building. Now, one thing you notice now, since the the woodwinds in this particular virtual instrument library don't really stand up to the brass section here and the entire orchestra. What we can do is, in a very kind of natural way, bring this back down to a mezzo forte. It's no longer all that important, so it doesn't hurt to do this. What it's going to do in contrast is bring out this woodwind melody so that the audience can more readily hear it whenever it's being played. And of course, in a personal orchestra setting, the players will know to listen for the melody. They'll automatically adjust, but it can also be helpful to make these indications, especially in parts of stacking complexity, um, just to ensure that the players know exactly where they should focus. It's usually pretty obvious when you listen to to a lot of music, especially classical music. Um, the composers will make it quite clear which instruments have the most value to be heard above the others. So let's see how that worked. Now what I'm seeing here is that it wasn't quite as distinguished as you would have wanted it to be. Hey Rich, thank you so much for following. So this part here, what I might do is I might simply just use the little hack that we talked about earlier, by bringing these parts and stacking them to a multiple layer. Now, again, this is just what I do with finale because I often run into this problem where the melody has trouble being heard. And even in my settings, it is supposed to detect solo, or I should say, melodical instruments above accompaniment. But it's a software, it's computers. It's kind of hard to always get that result in every situation. So just for the sake of audio, I'm going to stack these layers here. And to me, it just sounds perfect. Like it's not what you want to see in printed music, but it works so well. So that's why I do it. And again, whenever I do go to finally print the music, I'll just go back in and delete these parts. Finale makes it pretty easy to do this. You just simply go in and kind of reverse what you just did. Now, I don't believe you'll be able to see the dialogue windows that I'm pulling up. I haven't quite. There's just so many of them that Streamlabs doesn't really adequately capture all of these windows, and I have to go in and manually open each one through Streamlab, so it's a bit tedious. But basically, when you figure out the commands and the controls and all the dialogue windows to perform acts like this, it becomes extremely beneficial and eases the user's productivity tremendously. All right, so I'm gonna say that this section pretty much is blocked in. I'll say that we're still basically blocking because I really haven't done much more than just write in basic melodies and harmonies. Um, what I called embellishment, I'm gonna do again later. It's something that it kind of takes a bit more thought, because it's more original in nature than simply pulling out the basic elements of a song and putting it into the arrangement. Now the funny thing is this next part, it involves a guitar solo, that uses a lot of interesting techniques that you usually only can perform on guitars. But the beauty of it is even whenever you are um, rearranging these sorts of parts for another instrument, you can still emulate the character of that particular melody by using other techniques, by by knowing what instrument you want to apply it to, and taking the nature of that instrument and finding some way of like reestablishing that sort of sentiment through that instrument. Um, Now, what I think I'm going to do here is actually create a little brass fanfare. I'm thinking probably trumpets and French horns, possibly adding in the trombones and or tubas later. But I'm just gonna block in the basic melody through the trumpets here, and see how it comes out. Oops. Now, what I think I'll do, now that I see what the basic structure, what I've gotten out of the solo here, I think what I'll do is I'll actually create full chords to kind of enhance just the guitar solo. I'm gonna listen to it real quick just to know exactly what I'm working with. Now, in a typical orchestra, full orchestra, I should say, you can have as little as one trumpet player, but as many as like 4 or 5. The trumpets tend to produce a lot of sound on their own, so they don't typically need an entire section. What I think I'll do here is double up these octaves. And of course, this implies that there would be a second trumpet player. I think it's pretty appropriate to have 2, maybe no more than 3 trumpet players. For a piece like this, I can spread out I guess the nature of a brass fanfare among French horns, trombones, and the tuba. Now, I guess at this point, you would have to recognize what chords, since we're adding chords here, what chord is actually coming from the music. You certainly could, um, in your own creative way, create your own chord based more on what you think might sound better. But to be more true to the nature of the original piece, we're going to try to figure out what chords we had originally. So we are starting with the D, which has been our home bass note for pretty much since the beginning of this piece. Um, it seems that right now this music is written in the key of D minor. So, you know, whenever you drag the note along the staff, starting from this D note here, you go up to D, E natural, F, G, A, E flat, C, D, which is the D minor scale. So let's just suppose that for right now, this is playing the D minor chord. That's composed of D, F, and A. So we'll do a quick test. Oops. Not what I meant to do. Let's see. Now this chord, it sounds good on its own. Now the next note here is an E. Now it wouldn't make sense so much to just drag all the notes up again. Like you could do that. I think this creates a diminished chord. This, yeah, E diminished. But just to be like a little bit more exploratory, I suppose, you can look at these two surrounding notes. Right now, right here, I have it as the B and the G, and see if there's like other combinations that really kind of emphasize the progression of chords. Because in most classical music, you don't find chords preceding each other in such a fashion where all of them just move at the same distance in the same way, because it tends to sound a little bit boring, and it doesn't always sound compatible. So what we can do here, so we have the E diminished chord, but if I raise this B flat to a C, now we have the C major chord. So let's try that, see how that sounds. Now, in truth, that sounds okay. It has a sharp value to it. It like so quickly like stands out in your ear, and it does have a little bit of that, or I shouldn't say a little bit. It adds quite a bit of tension to the chord progression. Let's explore variations of this. So we have C major. What if we made it this? So this really, in essence, is the same thing as B minor chord. So we have the B here, E, and G. Oh wait, no. Now this would actually be another E diminished, but it's got like a raised value for the B natural. I'm trying to remember. So this would be a whole diminished, as opposed to B flat being half diminished. All right. Now taking that, let's try and see how that sounds. Now it's pretty similar to what we had before, except it's even less, I don't know, digestible. Like the ears don't really, it's just like there's something in it that doesn't sound natural, doesn't sound right. And I think at all times you want your music to sound, or for the sake of being harmonious, to sound like it flows naturally. Like there's no extra effort to hear or enjoy it. All right, so let's try doing something else. So we have this chord, C major. What if we flattened the G here? See how that sounds. Now, again, that's another example of adding a lot of tension very quickly in a chord progression. It works sometimes, but in this particular instance, we're not going to do that. So what I'm going to do, I'm just going to fiddle around with different chords. Sometimes this might take me a little bit of time because the chords can sometimes be hard to hear in some songs. So I'm kind of playing around with this chord here just to see which one I think will sound better. Now I think this chord progression here, and this would be A major. I think that is pretty satisfying to the degree that we're leading up to this phrase here, you know, being the root note, this being kind of like a transition note, and then coming up here, which is a little bit more stable ground, kind of like an uphill up toward a plateau. So one thing though, it is an interesting technique you can use. I'm trying to remember what it's called, but basically by spacing out the notes a little bit, it adds a little bit of kind of like that acoustic surround that I was talking about earlier by using octavated notes. And another thing, since we already have the melody being played by the trumpets here, we don't necessarily have to have the E value here. What I think I'll do is remove the E value there. It is already octavated in the octaves in the trumpet section. So I think I'll go ahead and remove the octave for the French horns here. Alright, so let's move on to the next couple of chords in the chord progression. Now I'm going to put these notes here as reference, and I see that we're kind of running out of the French horn's natural range. What I have the French horns and all the instruments in right now is they're set to the standard C orientation of instrument. Like, whereas you'll have instruments like the clarinet, which are written in B flat, the French horn is written in F, which it's interesting the history behind that, but it can be very challenging for somebody who doesn't have like thorough understanding of how those instruments are notated, to have to constantly switch back and forth between the C normal key, as it would be called, and for this particular situation, the F. But just for demonstration, if I were to remove the natural C concert pitch for like standard throughout all the instruments, you can see the French horns playing what would be seen on the sheet music whenever they actually go to play the music to match the rest of the notes. Now, this is the E we were, or the D we were talking about. French horn, or the trumpet, also plays in B flat, just like the clarinet, but in this scenario, it's not playing a D anymore; it's playing an E. But when you play it, it's going to sound exactly the same. But anyway, what I was getting at was the French horn has now reached beyond its limitations. The French horn can't play higher than what's written as a C on their music. So I'm going to rearrange this. Instead of having this way up here, I'm just going to bring it down an octave. And these might really just be like reference notes. I might remove them later, but just so I know what we're basing the chord on, we have here the F and the G. We went from having the D minor chord to having the A major chord. So typically one good way of seeing how easily two chords will connect with each other is simply by the placement of the next notes. Now, there are obvious ones, like you can move this E up to this F, which is what we did here. So there's that. But you could also bring this E down to the D, and you could keep the A here. Now let's see what that produces. This is the this would be D minor again, and it seems to be where we need to go. All right, so we'll keep that as is. So this next chord progression is G minor, and it seems to fit again. Like I was saying, you can easily transition two chords simply by placement. So for this chord right here with the A major chord, we brought the E down to a D, we kept the A the same, and we moved the C sharp up to an F. It's a bit of a leap, but C sharp is actually the same as D flat, so it's really just a note and a half. So by doing by looking at it that way, it can enhance your understanding of like what makes a good chord progression. It's not always going to work, but a lot of times it's a good sort of like way of evaluating or trying to figure out where to go next whenever you are developing chord progressions. All right, let's see what we got here. All right. So by having filled in these chords completely for the French horn, I now have at least a groundwork to build the rest of this phrase up with. So I think for the most part, the chords sound complete because we've completed the chords here with the French horn. But now would be a good time to add in a bass line. And we'll go ahead and do that with the trombone. And this can be usually when you're arranging a piece, it's easy to hear the bass. The bass tends to play pretty simple, easily identified notes. They tend to resonate and they build like the foundation for the rest of the chord. It's not usually going to mimic the melody. Sometimes it could, but it doesn't tend to sound all that great. But there are usually notes within the chord that really do enhance the chord, that you can pick from, that will just bring that acoustic resonance and natural sound to make the music more compelling. Now I think probably here, starting with the D, so we start with the D here for the D minor chord. Coming down to the A here for the A major chord would again use the root note. This is the A here in order to establish like a natural sounding bass line. Now, another thing you can do sometimes, you'll often use the root of the chord, but you can also use the fifth note in some circumstances in a way that it sounds like it'll really emphasize the chord. And here you can hear with that note added, it just enhances the fullness of the chord. If we removed the root note here, the A, it doesn't quite create the same effect. But that's just in this particular scenario, and it's probably merely because it follows the melody exactly, so it becomes a little bit like repetitive. But I am going to keep the fifth there along with the first. The fifth being the E here. We have A, and then the other note in the chord is the C sharp. Now, what happens if you put in the C sharp here, though? it doesn't really sound bad. It doesn't sound too bad, but I think this adds a little bit more of a natural sound. Instead of having that C sharp brought down here in the bass line, because the C sharp is such an interesting note in the chord, it draws a little bit too much attention to itself to be emphasized too heavily. And then here again, I'm adding octaves. The tuba is simply playing the same part as this bass line trombone here, with playing the root here in the D chord and the root here in the A chord, but simply playing it an octave lower. Now I'm going to complete the rest of the bass line here based on the notes I have here in these chords. Alright, so now we've created our brass fanfare, and I think it sounds pretty good. Oh, that was an accident. So that would really basically consist of the melody as it's written in the original song. Now I'm gonna think about the idea of adding a little bit more harmonic elements. Now we know we can use the percussion section here. And if I think back to the song, see this part, it's pretty involved with the drum kit here. What I think I might do actually is just add in a few other elements of the percussion section. For one thing, we might benefit from adding in a crash cymbal. Um, it's a fanfare after all, and those two tend to work really well together because you want to bring out the bombacity and the just the robust nature of a brass fanfare. All right, now the percussion in this library tends to play a little bit softer than the rest of the instruments. I'm using the Garrett's Personal Orchestra basic orchestra percussion, whereas the rest of the orchestra pretty much is using it's called the East-West Symphonic Orchestra. They have different qualities to them. I prefer the way that East-West sounds for particular instruments. I would even say that the percussion is pretty good for East-West, but the East-West percussion isn't fully integrated into one instrument the way that the Garrett's Personal Orchestra does. So that's why I use it, even though it would be extremely beneficial to use the East-West Quantum Leap percussion. But let's hear what we have here. All right, so that doesn't sound bad. Now, what I just thought about, a good way to really bring out this fanfare by using the percussion might be by incorporating a timpani. Now, I use a lot of timpani rolls. This can be achieved though without timpani rolls, but so let's go ahead and see how it would sound. Now, the timpani, being a bass instrument, is going to generally follow along with whatever the bass line is doing. Usually you only have about 4 timpani drums to work with. So even though it's limited in the nature of the instrument, it can still be used in a versatile way, um, just by just kind of like enhancing the sound of this particular phrase. And it's peculiar. It's like peculiar science figuring out how to do that, but generally it's not something you'd have to think too hard about. Right here, I just use the root of this chord here, the D minor chord, to use the root of this chord here, the A major chord. Then continue to use the root here for this D minor chord. Now this chord here, this is the G minor chord. The D is actually the 5th note of the chord, and as it turns out, the bass line tends to work well with the 5th of the chord being used. So I guess you could say kind of got lucky. We just double up the D here, and we still end up, within the standards of a typical bass line. So here, let's see how it sounds without rolls. I feel like I might end up changing it. Now, since I guess I'm a little bit indulgent when it comes to tremolos, I'm going to go ahead, or I should say percussion rolls. I'm going to go ahead and add in the percussion roll for this timpani. Just because I think it adds, especially for a fanfare, you want it to sound big and bombastic. So it's not a bad idea to have the timpani play rolls here. But instead of having rolls throughout the whole section, I think I'll delete it here and just add accents to these 2 notes, because this moving part here, it really adds that tension to this chord progression. So I'm just going to add 2 accents here. And I'm also going to add a little decrescendo leading up to a crescendo here. All right, so again, since this moving part has so much impact, I'm gonna also double up the crash cymbal here, so it follows the moving notes. Now, again, I talked about the bass drum being kind of like the pulse or the heartbeat of the orchestra, and I think, again, with the nature of a fanfare, it's beneficial to add in these bass notes following the bass line, kind of like being the pulse here. Typically, what you can do here, I can send this note to the 2nd layer, and it will, in that case, I can use the full dotted half note, but because finale has the tendency to crash on me, I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to play it safe and put it in with the 1st layer. But it's definitely a tool that you most likely end up using if you're actually writing music for the intentions of printing it. Okay, so now we have a bass drum added to this percussion section, but what about the snare drum? Perhaps here you could argue snare drum rolls. You could add in a little pulsating snare drum. For now, I'm gonna leave it the way it is because we've exhausted the snare drum quite a bit. I just want to see how it'll sound if I don't use it in this section. All right, so we have the melody complemented by the harmonic elements of the chord. Now we have a percussion section. Now the strings, I think it would be very beneficial to add in strings here. just like with the timpani here having playing roles, I like to do something with the strings where they play tremolos in parts of, of loud volume. And a fanfare works pretty well with tremolos. Another thing that you can do, though, you can add in, I'm not sure exactly what you'd want to call it, but like arpeggiated notes, basically, or scales, to add to the drama of it. So, what I'm going to do for the next couple minutes is just kind of experiment with different ideas, just kind of think about what I want to do. So, give me just a moment and I'll put something together. All right, so what I started with here, so I have the string, this violin part playing a tremolo. I also put in a couple scales to lead up to the preceding or the following notes. This note here, this E, I brought up an octave from the original melodic line, which is here in the trumpets, the D up to the E. This is still going D up to E, except we brought it up to another octave just to make it a little more dramatic. And I added a trill to it. Now the rest of it I have playing tremolos. And I think I'm gonna see how that sounds so far. And I think that sounds good. What I can do here, since this staff here I put together quickly just because I didn't think I was gonna really need two violin staffs. I realize in hindsight I would have benefited from having two different violin staffs, but I'm gonna basically just arpeg or octavate this this part here for the violins to represent the second violin part. The viola, I think you can see how it sounds if I simply copy and paste the part and then listen to it and see what I think. What I think I'll do, because it doesn't sound bad at all, of course, but what I think I might do just to add emphasis to these chords here, I'm going to pull these notes for the viola into one of the other notes from the chord. So we have, this is the D again. No, that's F. And this chord here is the D minor chord. All right, so let's see, I got here the D minor chord and then the G minor chord. All right, so if I do D, D, that would fall within the scope of those two chords. Let's see how that sounds. All right, not bad. So bring the D up to another note here. Just the E, maybe? And that way it has a way of like still kind of leading upward like the rest of the orchestra is right now. And even though that was an accident, that note being up there, this probably would sound better playing this note right here instead of this one. But what I can do just for dramatic effect is create this kind of I don't know what you want to call it. It's like a lagged effect, which adds more tension to the chord progression here, especially since the chord doesn't actually change between these two notes. They're written differently, but it's actually the same chord. It adds even more tension and variation to it. Yeah, I like that. All right, so for the cellos and the bass, now the bass I'll go ahead and block in because it's just probably going to follow most of what the tuba is doing. All right, so I'm just looking at the chord. So we had the D minor chord followed by the A major chord. And the cello is a very versatile instrument and works great with chords in that it really can pick and choose pretty much any note in the chord, and depending on where it's placed on the staff, it'll be pretty complementary. But we don't have to mash in all of these chords and all of these instruments. So I wanna potentially just use these two middle notes, the tenor and alto notes, in some way. All right, so the A is the root. So we have C sharp and E to work with. So we have and it doesn't necessarily have to be those two notes every time. I think I'm going to keep this here. And the good thing about that is we're kind of stacking notes to the chord progressively throughout this chord progression to almost like an expanding motion, like breathing, to basically just to fill out the orchestra and the sound sound quality a little bit more. All right, now I could have kept the Ds here like I did with the violas, but since the viola's already playing that, um, it might be beneficial to use some of the other chord or the notes in the chord. Now, since in both instances of this chord progression, this middle note was missing until I added in this cello part. So what I think I'll do, this is actually the D minor chord. But what's missing here, we have the F, the D, and another D, but we haven't put in yet the B, what is it, the A, I'm sorry. So why not go ahead and add it in here? Oops. All right. Oh, I think we're fully fledged here, so let's take a sample. And what ended up happening, even though it was kind of an accident, is we brought the melody in tandem with the trumpet through the violins here. And I think it works really well. So I'm going to keep that like that. And I'd say for the most part, we're done blocking here. And this is, you could argue this has been quite a bit of embellishment too. Um, Typically, if I was in a hurry, I probably wouldn't spend this much time at this stage, but at the same time, the creative process is very flexible. It works either way, whatever keeps the vibes going. But I will just to add a little bit more here. I think I'm going to incorporate the choir, which is simply going to be blocking in chords. So some will probably take a couple minutes. I'll just go ahead and fill out this part here for the choir. Alright, so yeah, all I simply did here was add in these chords, the D minor, the A sharp, the A major, D minor, this is G minor, and the A major. So the next part, it's kind of a continuation of this idea. So I'll continue to add upon more with this fanfare. Probably be another couple minutes. Alright, so that was the melody. Now we're going to fill in the chords to fill out the fanfare. This would most definitely be the D chord, the root chord. And so we're down to a B flat here. B flat. I think that actually works there. That's a B flat major chord. I'd say the defining notes here for this chord would be the G and the A, even though we jump up from the G, get all the way up to this D and the C sharp and then back down to the A. But I think that's kind of where the melody kind of that's where the melody is really kind of like rooted to. It's almost like they added ornamentation to those two notes by adding in all these extra ones. So we have G and A. Now we're going from a B flat to what potentially? So let's see what happens when we simply move the G and keep the rest two of the two. That doesn't quite sound right. So if I think back to that, doesn't sound right either. Now this would be a good time to really think about the way the notes sound when they're stacked next to each other. The movement of them has a huge impact on how the audience kind of registers and feels the music that you play. So I'm going to play around with this chord here to see if I can kind of find one that really resembles the original chord progression. Alright, so I think this chord here, I think probably this should be what's played here. Let's see. In theory, you could argue that, but since we want to root the note of the chord from the melody, from this G and into this A, I think it works really well because what we do here is we have the G here, then we bring that G up to an A in the preceding chord, and it really just kind of enhances the melody. All right, so I'm going to continue plotting more chords here. All right, now this chord progression ended again at home base with the D minor. So I'll remember that as I block in the rest of the parts. Now you'll see here there's a little bit of conflict between this staff and this one. That can be fixed. Typically these sort of issues are best left to fix after the whole score has been written out. So I'm going to leave it for now, but there are tools to fix that. I'm going to go ahead and make these into octaves, just because it's consistent with what we've been doing. It certainly doesn't have to be, since we're getting close here, and in fact I need to make sure the trumpet can actually play this note down here. Okay, so it can. Another thing is, I explained this in the first tutorial that I didn't necessarily, when I printed or when I set up this document, typically for the brass section, I would have 2 French horn staffs and 1 or 2 trumpet staffs and 1 or 2 trombone staffs. I think I would have benefit from having at least 2 French horn staffs because from what you can see here, I'm stacking up a lot of notes into one staff, and that can be really challenging for the reader who's performing the piece to quickly decipher what notes they need to play. So what's understood here is that there's actually at least four different French horn parts by how the chords are fledged out. Now I added in the fourth notes. Sometimes I take them out. If I had the 2 staffs, I would most definitely use pretty much all 4 notes or indicate that one of the players shouldn't play that part by using rests. But that's just additional information. I'm thinking I'm probably going to add in a second French horn staff just to make the notation look a bit cleaner. But for now, I'm just going to leave it like that. The software does have a tendency to run into trouble whenever I do try to add in staffs here. So for the sake of brevity and not experiencing technical difficulties, I'm going to just leave it like that for now. Okay, so we filled out the fanfare. So now let's look to the percussion, following the same pattern here with the timpani. That emphasizes the bass line here. Now this is an example of when the harmonic, or I should say the harmonic quality of the timpani part here, it doesn't necessarily exactly suit or I shouldn't say suit, it doesn't follow the chord progression that we already have mapped out here. Now for here it's fine because we use D here for the D minor chord, which is the root, and then D here for this B flat, no, this is B, D, yeah, B flat major chord, which includes B flat, D, and F. Here it becomes a little more tricky because, again, you typically only work with four timpanis, more if you're lucky, but given that situation, you don't want to use too many different notes or else you'll need more drums. But what seemed to work here, and I'm gonna try it out here, or verify it, I should say, at least by testing out the sound. Having this A here written for the timpani, along with this part here, where we go from, again, the D minor to the, this is E flat major chords. No, this would be an E diminished chord, actually. This note here, the D, doesn't fall into this E diminished chord. However, I have a theory that it actually won't be that excruciating of a discrepancy when the music is actually played back. I could be wrong, but we're going to test it out and see. So somehow, I think because of the nature of what the timpani is doing, by playing the role, and being kind of more like that element to the fanfare that's just adding in the acoustic to fill up the room, to fill out the orchestra. It doesn't necessarily have to be melodic at times, or harmonic, I should say. Just like how the bass drum, the snare drum, all the other unpitched instruments don't really have a note tied to them. They're just kind of used in a sense that it just like adds that beat or whatever sort of auxiliary sound to the orchestra. And in this circumstance, it kind of does the same thing with the timpani. All right, so we're going to leave that like that. Again, we want to add in crash cymbals. And the bass drum. And I think since, in my personal opinion, I really like the way the gong sounds, I think I'm going to add that into the mix also. Add in a gong of a medium size. All right. See how that sounds. All right, so we can go ahead and fill in the chords for the choir. Alright, and we'll finally finish it up with the strings here. So what I decided to do here was add some arpeggios instead of just simply going forward with these tremolos, just to add a little bit more variety. I feel like the more, as opposed, there's always a limit, but when you add in some variety to the harmonic elements, sometimes it can really enhance and full out like the full potential of that particular piece of music. Um, it's just like whenever you are dressing for the day. You could simply go with a shirt and pants, but let's say you're going to a football game. Um, you can really enhance the way you look by putting on a jersey over your shirt, by using face paint to convey your support for the team, by wearing a hat with the logo of the team, by using color coordination so with the team that you're rooting for, and it adds so much more character to the outfit you're wearing. And this is kind of the same thing. Of course, there's also such a thing as too much or things that are not complementary. Like if I were to see, I have these arpeggios following the chords, but if I were to rearrange the notes on this, add in a bunch of random notes, like bring this, like up here and do this down here and like, do all sorts of weird stuff. If it doesn't follow a pattern, it tends to be noticed, and it's just the same thing as whenever you're color coordinating or just at any rate just like putting together an outfit. So something to keep in mind. Now, something, I'm not a string player myself, but according to different theories on bowing, you would use these phrase markings to indicate which direction the string player needs to bow. Now, of course, in a more relaxed setting, string players can figure something out, but we'll go ahead and make an indication just for which direction the string players are going to bow. Whether they're going to go bow downward or up might just depend on the placement of the note compared to the rest of the notes, but since we're doing this at a kind of louder volume, we'll say we should have fewer notes in each phrase marking just so that the string player can really add some volume to each of the notes. So we'll just do these triplets, which come naturally with this time signature. And this theory that I've been using is really just my own. I haven't learned anything really about bow technique other than just how to bow and how to know which direction to bow. But as far as composition goes, a lot of it has been experimental. So I wouldn't take what I have to say, um, as the academic standard, because it isn't. This is just what I've chosen to do just based on what I know, and am open to suggestions, I should say, just as I learn more things. Since we ran out of the range for the viola here, I just kind of did this thing, this like sustaining this note basically, but through repetitive um, note articulations. Because why not? Like, let's see how it sounds. Maybe it'll sound weird, maybe it won't. Now, since we have the bow indication that it would, the player would bow all these notes with the same bow stroke, I don't think that would work well here. I'm going to go ahead and delete that there, and then remove that from that note also. I think it would add like a very crisp sound to it, having the bow played in opposing directions for these notes. And I also think it would be beneficial here to add in some sort of text expression, because this part right here, it's very, the articulations are rougher than simply playing like smooth connected arpeggios, which slurs generally suggest. These markings are also called slurs. Um, so I wonder if I can find from the Italian vernacular musical database something that kind of resembles what sort of style this should be played in. And I'm thinking of one that I might like. I don't know if it's not necessarily appropriate, but just for the sake of adding an example, I'm gonna put this one here. And I'm gonna look up what exactly that means so that I have some idea of how that would work. All right, so this means, this is con bravura, which basically means to play boldly or brilliantly. And I think that can be said really of all of this. I could add this into, you know, up here for the brass section. Oh, that's the wrong one. I could add it here for the timpani. I'm not going to. I could add it here with the choir. And I'm going to go ahead and add it here for actually the beginning of this whole phrase, which I would say probably extends more along or through this whole 8 bars instead of just the 4. And I think that's a good way of using the verbal or written language to convey what you want the player to actually perform whenever they're reading your music. It's just one of those enhancing qualities that helps to give you the reader of the music the understanding of what you're trying to convey through the simplest ways possible. It doesn't necessarily need to be so fully articulated all the time, and we don't have to use the Italian language that originated from the Renaissance era of art. You can use everyday terms. If you wanted to simply say play with brilliance, that's just as effective as saying con bravura, because at any rate, it translates what you mean and what you want for the player to perform. All right, so we're just gonna fill out the rest of the string orchestra here. It's taking a little bit more time than I would have liked to, simply because of how many notes I've put down. But we'll just simply put in the bass line for, oops, for the rest of this here with the double bass. Alright, so let's see what we have here. Let's play this back really quickly. Alright, now the segment has run into 2 hours, which is a bit unexpected because if you think about what's been accomplished so far, we started right here. We started right here. So we've produced about 4, 8, 12, 16. So we produced 16 bars of music, and that took 2 hours, of course. Since I spent a lot of time explaining things, it could have happened a little bit more quickly if I was more focused, but that's pretty much what can be expected. Like the amount of time you'll put into really crafting a piece of music, like you can easily throw together something quickly, but I think if you really want to bring out like the symphonic elements, the melody, the harmonic values, and really make your piece interesting, something that's really a piece of work, it will usually take quite a bit of time. Everybody's However, everybody's mind works differently. I think there's several different ways somebody can approach writing or arranging music. But this just from what I've learned just in life in general, like, when you put more time into something, it tends to pay off. And in this case, when you put more time into music, people can hear that it's really been crafted from the bottom up. So I'm gonna close this out real quick by just proofing the score, seeing if there's anything I want to add. And then finally, we're going to play what we have so far. Now, I noticed whenever the trumpet was playing earlier, the trumpet here carries the melody. Like I said, the software here, for the sake of recording something that's easy for the listener to hear, I'm going to double up this melody by copying the part into a second layer just to bring the sound out. Again, not good for print music, but just for the sake of recording, I'm going to do that. And now we're just going to listen to what I have so far. Alright, so I think that sounds pretty satisfactory. Now, there are a couple of things I noticed because I hadn't really listened to the whole thing put together before this moment, but this part here, it's a bit repetitive. So I think next time I'm going to work on making this a little bit more of something than just a kind of like basic underlying that's just repeated the whole time. But yeah, so I think that's going to conclude it for today. Thank you so much for anybody who stopped in to watch. See you guys next time.